Using stories from Native American culture, Silka reveals how white culture seeks to destroy through the domination of Native culture and extraction of wealth from the earth. One way white culture seeks to destroy is through the domination of Native culture. On page 169, Silka presents this idea. In the passage, Teo begins by addressing how, even though the scalp ceremony rids his memories of the war, what still remains are the effects of white culture and its cities on not only himself, but all natives. This is then followed by the white shell bead story. In the story, a man discovers beads on a trail and is mesmerized by their beauty. Despite suspecting that they were stolen from a grave, the man takes these beads. And as days pass, he can only pay attention to the beads, disconnecting him from his entire life he had previously lived. The tale of the man and the beads then transitions to Teo's perspective of the native experience, where he sees the loss of native land and notices the way in which natives try to cope with this loss by drinking, reminiscing upon the war days, and protecting the land which is no longer theirs. Towards the beginning of the passage, Teo mentions Bettany's words, saying they were never the same after that. They had seen what the white people had made from the stolen land. He uses this to emphasize how the white culture and cities that were established upon land that originally belonged to the natives changed the natives. This idea is told through the shell story, which serves as an allegory to explain how white culture and cities affected the natives. At the beginning of the story, it is described that the white shell beads were stolen from a grave, pointing to how the beads are not the man's, yet as he admired them, he took something that did not belong to him. This parallels the way in which natives admired white culture and cities, accepted them, and perceived them to be superior to their own world, despite these cities being built upon land that originally belonged to the natives. Teo realizes this obsession of natives to the white world towards the end of the text. He wanted to scream at Indians like Harley and Helen Jean and emo that the white things they admired and desired so much, the bright city lights and loud music, all these things had been stolen, torn out of Indian land. Teo's realization of the way in which natives have become obsessed with the white world and culture points to the way in which native culture has been lost through the domination of white culture upon natives. This is then followed by the idea that he suspected where they came from, demonstrating how, despite being aware of the dark origins of these beads, he chose to take them just as natives, possibly aware of the detrimental effects of white cities and their culture, still chose to admire what the whites made of their lands. The story then continues to describe how, although he has never touched them, all he can think of, all he dreams of, were these white shell beads hanging in that tree. This connects to how, even though natives have not even first-handly truly been a part of the white culture, the only thing they can think about is the influence of this culture. And rather than focusing on their own culture, which is represented in the story by the life he had lived before the day he found those beads, the natives chose to focus on the white way of living instead. This is seen through Teo's inspection of Bettany's apartment on page 127, where he says, "The calendars Bettany got for free, all of it seemed suddenly so pitiful and small compared to the world he knew the white people had. A world of comfort in the sprawling houses he'd seen in California." This emphasizes how, after seeing all of Bettany's cheap possessions in his small house and comparing them to the expensive white worlds, he perceived the world and lives of natives to be pitiful and inferior to that of whites, once again demonstrating the way in which natives not only focused on and admired the white way of living, but also inferiorized their own culture by doing so. The quote, "He could not eat and he could not work," further represents how natives lost all different aspects of what was their normal way of living due to their admiration of white cities and culture, which had taken over and dominated their lives. Teo then directly connects this shell story back to the experiences of natives, saying every day they had to look at the land from horizon to horizon, and every day the loss was with them. It was the dead and buried, and the mourning of the lost going on forever. To further show how white cultural domination has ultimately forced natives to see the devastating results of this domination every day, forever. After seeing Western society and its advanced technology, which is represented by the white shell beads in the story, Native Americans become captivated by it and consequently jaded to their own rich culture, as shown through the man's inability to return to the past life he once lived. The display of white people's power led Native Americans to forget their own culture and way of life. thus giving white people more control over the land. This occurrence can be explained by a term used in post-colonial criticism: cultural colonization. The extension of colonial power or Western society can be furthered through the diminishment and eventual replacement of the pre-existing culture of the land. White settlements suppress Native American life, both physically and culturally, resulting in the domination of white culture. This loss of Native American culture gives way to Eurocentrism, a worldview that sets European culture as the standard for all other non-Western cultures, ruling those as inferior. Parallel to this concept, Native Americans are misled into believing that their way of life is lesser than that of white people. The natives' captivation of white cities and culture resulted in the loss of their own culture, as they, like the man with the beads, forgot of the traditions of their lives before being exposed to the white culture. This loss of culture makes clear the white domination over natives that also initially brought the destruction of native culture through settlements. Furthermore, Silko uses this to emphasize that what must be done is for natives to return to their own identities and traditions, rather than following a culture that is not only attainable, but also detrimental to themselves. Another way white culture destroys is through the exploitation of Earth's natural resources. In addition to telling Teo's story, Silko incorporates traditional poems and stories throughout the novel. After visiting Bethany, the Navajo medicine man, Silko tells a poem story about a magician named the Gambler, or Ka'oyo. He waits for people to wander up to his house, serves them blue cornmeal, and then gambles with them for all their belongings and ultimately their lives. When the people have no more left to give, he tells them to bet their lives on the possibility that they can guess the contents inside a bag, which the people never guess correctly, leading them to their death. The gambler even gambles and wins against the storm clouds, which results in devastation of the lands and people. To counter this, the sun seeks help from Spider-Woman, who instructs him on how to counter the gambler. And with this knowledge, the sun goes to the gambler, and at the very end, the sun succeeds in guessing the gambler's final question. Rather than attempting to kill him, which he knows would not succeed, he takes out the gambler's eyes, turns them into stars, and frees the storm clouds. In the beginning of the story, Silko states that the gambler is handsome and very good to look at, detailing how he is always wearing spruce greens, dressed in the finest white buckskins, and has strings of red coral in his ears. This description of the gambler initially establishes the connection Silko is making between the traditional story and society today. Like the gambler, the technology and settlements of white people are attractive and eye-catching. The gambler also shows off his fancy clothes and expensive beads, and gets his visitors to gamble with him, their clothes and beads for his. Likewise, white people display their wealth and lure in other people, tempting them to leave their own culture in exchange for white culture. The visitors usually agree to gamble because they only have their old clothes, so they figure they don't have much to lose. Anyway, they might win all his fine things. When people of other culture encounter Western society, they view their own culture as inferior and willingly give up their way of life, in hopes that they'll gain wealth through white culture. The story continues, and when they started gambling with him, they did not stop until they lost everything they owned, which alludes to how white people have taken advantage of minorities, claiming land that had already belonged to indigenous people. Although white people have taken so much from minorities, they continue to portray themselves as the good guys that civilize the so-called uncultured wild people, such as Native Americans. This can be seen through the gambler's final offer to the people, when he says, "I'll tell you what, since I'm so good and generous, I'll give you one last chance." After the people lose in their final bet with the gambler, Silko states, "They were in his power, they had lost everything," expressing how once people of other cultures have given up all their wealth, white people will have full control over them. Silko then includes this detail about how the gambler cuts out the victims' hearts and lets their blood run down into the bins of blue cornmeal. The blue cornmeal every new victim eats contains the blood of the gambler's past victims, demonstrating an ever-increasing cycle of white people using their growing influence to further take over other cultures. This also depicts how white people can pit minorities and even people of the same culture against each other, forcing them to commit acts of violence against one another. One time, the gambler even captured the storm clouds, and as a result, the land dried up and the people and the animals were starving, which signals how white people not only take away the riches of other people, but also take control of nature, using it for their own gain. The selfish actions of white people do not just affect nature, they have lasting impacts on the people occupying the land, who are often minorities. The next segment of story seemingly suggests a solution for this issue. After the son sees the damage the gambler has caused, he goes to the grandmother, Spider-Woman, and asks her for advice for how to outsmart the gambler. Then he faces the gambler and tells him, "I'm fasting," when offered the cornmeal, by turning down the cornmeal containing the blood of the other visitors and following the instructions of Spider-Woman. The son avoids falling victim to the gambler's ploy. In the same way, Native Americans, such as Teo, must keep to the traditions of their culture instead of falling for the deceptive claims of white people. The gambler, who represents white people, lives on the peaks of the Zuni Mountains. Yet he gradually acquires wealth from the possessions of his victims and the clouds he has stolen. Just as the gambler took advantage of his visitors and the earth to gain material wealth, white people disrespect nature, bringing destruction to the environment in order to reap its riches. Although white people did not originally occupy many of the territories it controls today, they gained control of them by establishing cities and treating the land as one large mine from which they could extract resources from until it was destroyed, otherwise known as colonialism. Silko gives other examples of this throughout the novel, such as clearing out canyons and plateaus, hunting animals to feed entire logging companies, and mining the land for uranium until the land and water was contaminated. The story can also be examined through a feminist lens, as the protagonist of the story was successful due to the assistance from a female character. Spider-Woman represents not only native tradition, but also the creator of the world, as she uses the native plants and pollen the sun gives her, and she is the grandmother of the sun itself. The critical role of a woman to the native culture contrasts the patriarchal ideal for a woman established by many cultures around the world, especially in the Anglo-American traditions we focused on. This representation of a female figure in Native American traditions demonstrates the more appreciated role of women as figures or leaders. The manner in which the sun trusts her guidance and ideas furthers her position as a trusted figurehead. The gambler's exploitation of all those that come to gamble allows him to gain wealth by unfairly taking their possessions. In his gambling, he also takes the wealth of the storm clouds, alluding to how white people destroy nature and the lands of people for the sake of gaining wealth. In order to combat the wealth gained by whites through the destruction of the land, Silko emphasized the importance of following native traditions and values to subvert white exploitation.